Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I'm the program associate at YIVO. And today, we are here to watch a film about Celia Dropkin, Burning Off the Page, and it's directed by Eli Gorn. For those who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. Our library and archive contains over 24 million documents and 400,000 books, and they are used by researchers from all around the world. We have lots of Yiddish classes and exhibitions and events just like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast archival and library holdings. And so welcome. We are so excited to have you joining us, and please stay tuned after the film for a panel discussion with Columbia professor Agi Laguko and the poet Edward Hirsch. Enjoy the film.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming. And this is a very special screening for many, many reasons. First of all, it's the home of Celia's archives. And I spent a lot of time working on these archives in this very building. Then it's the home of the family, Celia's family, many of whom are here tonight. So thank you very much for coming. I'm just delighted and so happy to see you guys. And people who worked on the film, not the least of which is our composer, Frank London. There he is. And Frank hasn't been out in a while because of an illness, and this is am I right, Frank? This is your first outing in months. Yeah. Oh, I am just so honored and delighted to have you here, Frank. It's really such an honor. So thanks for coming, and thanks for that beautiful score. I mean, it really made the film. So thank you very much. So I thought I'd start just a little bit with about the genesis of the film. I was approached, feels like 50 years ago, by a young woman out of Montreal named Bracha Feldman, and she is the producer of our film. And she was looking for somebody, she needed some experience. She had produced some small films, and she was a social worker, mostly social worker, but she studied Celia in university, and she was overwhelmed by Celia's poetry and thought that her story would make a great film. So I didn't know exactly what to think, but I was kind of impressed with her passion. And then there was something palpable in her feelings about Celia. So then I kept doing some research, and I found out that she wasn't the only one. There were many, particularly women, of course, who were just so affected and moved by Celia's poetry, and you can see why. I mean, and so you could, even as a man, you can understand the feelings that are involved. Anyway, so I didn't know whether I really wanted to get involved. But I felt the passion. And then what really put me over the top was I would say, I'm thinking about making a film about this erotic Yiddish poet. And every time I said it, literally, everyone would burst out laughing. They'd go, erotic Yiddish? That's ridiculous. And that was partly what actually really was motivating, in the sense that here was something unusual, and it's a surprise, like to put Yiddish and erotic together. Nobody knew, and that's what I think was inspiring for me, is to tell a story that very few people knew of, and a facet and to illuminate a facet of American Jewish culture that people don't know about. So it was an honor to do it, and the film, it turned out well. It was a labor of love. It was very lengthy. Films are like, these films just take so much time and effort, I was very lucky to have, my background was in television and film, and I worked a lot in the Jewish community of Vancouver doing various projects. And people knew me, so they invested in the film. That's where the money came from. So this was all, I'm from Vancouver. Bracha was from Montreal. Bracha Feldman was from Montreal. And this is a kind of a Canadian-produced film, which is a little unusual in and of itself. So that's it. I just want these guys to talk a little bit, and then we'll be open to questions. But thank you, everybody who came. And many of you are in the film, and I'm deeply honored. Thank you. And okay, take it away.
First of all, it's extremely hard to make a film about poetry and about a poet. And I was so impressed by the form of the documentary itself, how it incorporated reenactment, animation, the way the letters disappeared. I just thought that was all wonderfully creative, and so great congratulations to you on finding a visual medium for the poetry. I thought that was really marvelous. My people are proud of you.
I'm coming from you. It means a lot. Thank you very much, Edward.
Do you want to say more about your connection with Dropkin? Yeah? No?
I was very...
let me say one thing about Edward. We did this interview with Edward, and I'm working with the editor. And every time we didn't know whether we needed a clip to put anything, we'd say, go to Edward. It doesn't matter, you take the whole interview, just take a section of it. Everything he said was just, I don't know if you could hear me, but it was pearls. All of his entire interview was just so brilliant. And it became a joke almost. Oh, we need a line. Let's go to Edward. Let's put him into the.
I've just been waiting for someone to ask. Finally, someone came and asked.
It was really remarkable. Thank you. I mean, everybody was eloquent. You could see how blessed we were to have.
But it was beautifully cut because you used us so well. We came in at different, points. I'm saying the thing, I thought it was pretty original about the way she used the imagery of the crucifixion, and then you just dramatized it through the eroticism so well with that poem.
I'm glad. Thank you.
One thing I would like to say is that one of the moments, if you remember, where she says you must burn in hell 3 times like B, that kind of translate, that sort of translate quality. Do you remember the title of that poem is To a Young Poet? And that one of the things that might be important here is that these are poems and that they're constructed, and that advice is not just advice on how to live, it's not just eroticism, it's how you must live as a poet. And the young poet that she's addressing thinks that you come to poetry through analysis, through critical reasoning, through rational thinking. And she's kind of making an argument against that. She's sort of making an argument that poetry itself is a bodily art. The poetry itself comes out of the body. The poetry itself is erotic. And that poetry must tap something that's unconscious, not clearly rational. There's a kind of argument here about the nature of art itself, and that art itself must come out of the unconscious. And her advice to a young poet, which is she's mimicking Rilke's To a Young Poet and saying, but Rilke's imitation of a young poet is totally spiritual. What Rilke is totally telling the young poet is you devote yourself in this monastic way to poetry. And in this very short poem of hers, she undercuts this and undermines it with this other idea that no, that's the wrong way. The royal road to poetry is through the unconscious and as a bodily art. And I think that that's one of the things that's kind of driving this whole project. And as you can see, it unsettles so many people because of its unabashed nature, but also because partially it's in Yiddish, And partially they just don't expect this argument in poetry itself as for the way that poetry itself operates and moves.
What'd I tell you?
Let's cut to Edward.
And one of Celia's biggest fans.
Yes.
Absolutely, Aggie.
So I want to congratulate you, Eli, on completing this journey. It's been, what, more than 8 years since the interviews?
Please don't remind me.
It's been, I think, like the room is filled with Celia's greatest fans. I have to say I'm incredibly thrilled to be here because my fascination and love for Celia started when I came to Columbia to do a graduate school, and it's a little bit over 18 years, so I sort of have a high of love for Dropkin. It's really the time when you get Yiddish literature syllabi with almost no women. And there was 1 week dedicated to women poets, and Dropkin was one of them. And I signed up to do a presentation on her, started reading her poetry, and my mind was just blown away. And I'm like, is it possible? It's Yiddish, it's the 20s, 30s, and she's talking so boldly about gender power dynamic between not only eroticism and sexuality, but also gender power dynamic between people not only in love, but also in various aspects of life. So I was really, really fascinated by her. So it's so incredible to see that within the last 20 years, more or less, she has become a household name. Like Yiddish artist, Frank, hi, so happy to see you here and hear the beautiful music. And every Yiddish summer program will read Dropkin's poetry, and you get, if you just Google Dropkin, you'll see YouTube videos of students in the Yiddish Book Center performing her songs. So it's really, I think, it's really uplifting and inspiring to see the journey she's made. And I want to just one more thing, adding to Edward's comment about to a young poet. I was also thinking that she's taking Freud's theory of sublimation of desire, right? That it comes from the dark subconscious spot. And I think that I really loved what was said about the poem and the mother poem, which again, she was revolutionary in presenting, sort of subversing the stereotypes. When you think about Yiddish mama, you're not thinking about a young widow, right? You're sort of thinking about this archetype created by male authors, male writers usually, overbearing, catering to every need. No, here is a woman who makes a decision to marry no one at the age of 22. And what I loved about this goes back to the Freud sublimation theory that Dropkin, the poetic voice, says that the mother's unfulfilled desire entered her and comes out as poetry, right, as art. And so it's been really special. And also it was wonderful to see my warm thoughts in regards to the family, to the relatives I met. Hi, Ken. It was so wonderful to see many other images of her, because when you, again, there are a few images available on the internet, so it was so nice to see a person behind the name and the poems. And I would also love to, I don't know if I can ask the audience, but what's happening with her canvases? It would be so wonderful to organize an exhibition of her paintings. Okay. Okay.
And the photos,
okay.
by the way, I spent many an hour with
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Oh.
Elizabeth, who you saw in the film, who provided most of those archival photos. So thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastic.
Thank you for making it happen.
Yeah, great.
Can I say something?
Please.
Since we're in YIVO, I want to reiterate something I said in the film, and it comes up at different times. I do not think you can underestimate the tremendous pressure there is on Yiddish poets in the 1920s to write about social issues. Yiddish poetry, what comes out of the labor movement, it is tremendously, it grows in the late 19th century out of the sweatshop poets. And the tremendous pressure from the progressive left to write about subjects that are important to the whole community. We understand why. We live in social times. We understand why the pressure on poets to lend their voice to causes is very strong. And if you look through the magazines like the New Masses, say of the 1920s, teens and 20s, you'll see that Yiddish poets are just lining up to make the case of the worker. And it was extremely radical of this group of poets to turn away. I mean, that's why I said in the film it was a hoot, because it's really rebellious to say that the world, what matters is our own interior lives, not just the social lives of our people. Because you're living, just remember, we're living in immigrant New York. We're surrounded by poverty. We're surrounded by trouble. We're surrounded by people trying to break the unions. And you can understand why poetry wants to lend its voice to that. And then in the midst of this pressure, you have this whole group of poets who then decide, no, we're not going to do that. We are actually going to stand up for our own interior lives, that the world is not entirely a social construction. We have interior lives. The unconscious is very much part of this. I'm sure they were reading Freud. And then within that, you have the radicality of a woman's voice saying, I'm going to go even further than that. I'm going to even be more extreme than that because I'm going to press these subjects that are really no one wants to talk about. And I'm going to go there. And I think you get the buzz in her poetry a lot is the breaking of the rules. There's no doubt in my mind that the electricity that she's getting from her poems is partially saying, you don't expect anyone to say this. And that the abjection, for example, the non-normative sex, for example, the Christian iconography, which she knows is really, her parents must be turning over in their graves when she says, hammer me, nail me. I mean, it's really radical, and it's getting its force partially by its breaking of the conventional ideas of what within her community people thought Yiddish poetry should be.
I have a question.
You're the expert.
But I would add to that, absolutely. But I think we also need to remember about the European roots of many of her poems and many of the Yiddish poets, because when you think about her first poem, A Kush, A Kiss, that was also featured here, it's really deeply rooted in Russian modernism as well, which sort of, and we saw her correspondence with Gnesin, right? Russian literature and culture was also very deeply rooted in many Yiddish poets who came over to America, so I think it's like an amalgam of the influences that come out.
So I have a question. What would she have, if she had written these poems in English, let's say she was an English poet, would she have been considered as good as we're looking at her today? I don't think it's a misplaced question. Would her poetry have been recognized for what it was in that time if she was writing in English, if she was an English poet?
I think she still would have run into trouble.
Well, I'm sure she would have, but
yeah.
would she have, what kind of trouble? I mean,
the trouble
good
that
trouble.
I mean the trouble that she would have run into was the misogyny of American modernism. And I think the trouble that she would have run into was the trouble that Edna St. Vincent Millay and Leonie Adams and Louise Bogan and a whole group of female lyricists of the 1920s ran into, which is, what Philip Larkin once said about sentimentality in poetry is, we think poems are sentimental when we think people have more feeling than they're supposed to have. And Pound and Elliott wanted something really cold. And someone like Amy Lowell really suffered from this as a same-sex poet who was writing, heated homosexual poems, homoerotic poems. And I think that the free verse aspect of her poetry would have been very welcomed. I think it would have been a forerunner no question for the poets I mentioned. That's why Adrienne Rich found her at the moment when Adrienne Rich was discovering her own Jewishness as a way to create deepen her own sense of humanity and include men in humanity by turning to her own Judaism and her own Jewish experience. But I think Dropkin would have been there. It would have been a tremendous light for the poets that came afterwards. But one of my great modernist heroes is Marianne Moore. But Marianne Moore is really cold. And I think that the modernist, and then it turned into new criticism, and I don't want to give you too much of a whole lecture on American poetry, but that's my beat. It's very cold, it's very chilly, and that she is really going against the grain of that. And that's where I think when I myself was in my early 20s and was looking for a different model, that's when I discovered Russian poetry, that's when I discovered Polish poetry, that's when I discovered Miłosz and Herbert, and then later Szymborska, and later Zagajewski, and that's when I discovered the Turkish poet Nazım Hikmet. And I was looking for more heated models, and Dropkin and this group of Yiddish poets was, for me, part of this international ferment as a kind of alternative to the coldness of Anglo-American modernism.
I have a question to you about the unfinished memoirs and sort of who found them, who translated them, what's happening
Good question.
with them.
Celia and she had this correspondence with a writer in Israel who was a big fan of Genessens, and this writer found out about Celia's relationship, and they corresponded for many, many years. And towards the end of her life, maybe even quite a few years, maybe 10 years, this writer said, "Would you please write your memoirs of Genesen, and I will publish them in Israel," because Genesen was huge, and this guy was a big Genesen fan. So they wanted to find out more about him through her. So they had this relationship. She starts writing, and she has all these scribbles and papers. She does it for I think it's close to 10 years. She writes these memoirs. Never gets published. She dies. Never gets published. The family sends it to, and I don't remember who in the family. Maybe somebody knows, but it's not super important. So the family sends the memoirs to the Genazim archive in Israel. These scholars take the memoirs and they interpret it, and they edit them out, and they put out this document called Memories of Genesen. And it's her, it's the best of her, and they give it an interpretation. It's the best of all the writings. So it's in Hebrew, and we know it's there. Nobody had ever translated it into English. We hired a translator. We translated it into English, and we excerpted it and wove it in and out of the story. So it's a very good question.
When did you make the decision to have an actor reenact?
Pretty early. It was before we translated it. But these memoirs are, you can tell, the actor was just crazy good. She's one of Canada's great actresses, by the way. Her name is Gabrielle Rose, and she's a really strong working actress. She's been working in the industry for years, and she fell in love with Celia's story as well.
So it was a way to give it a first-person voice.
Well, and successfully, I would argue, in the sense that you felt some of what she was feeling towards this guy. You just sort of dove into her feelings for him. And so I thought that was an important feature in the film.
Did it make you mad that it was kind of part of the Nesson archive? Because it's sort of getting me mad.
Well, you can talk to Aggie about that.
I said it's sort of making me mad that it's part of the Nesson archive.
Right.
Well, yes, typical.
Yeah.
Typical. And you're right. Aggie spoke passionately about that. She was angry. She's angry with the misogyny and the sexism and the gender biases, and Aggie spoke very eloquently on that. So.
Most of it was edited out. There was, if you guys are looking into more background to the Dropkin-Gnessin story from the literary perspective, there was a great article that was published in the early 90s. There was an anthology, Gender and Text, and one of the editors, Anita Norridge, is right here. And there was an article by Dan Miron comparing Dropkin's poem Akush, a kiss, that was written in Russian, and Gnessin's Hebrew translation of the poem. And I was really happy to see it in the film here, that the Israeli author, Menachem, I forget the last name, Perry, actually admitted out loud that everybody thought this was the first modernist Hebrew poem by Gnessin, and nobody knew it was Dropkin. And what made my blood boil, with all due respect to Dan Miron and his scholarship, when I read this article, he sort of dismissed her, this poem without biblical allusions, and with this is just nothing. And still makes my blood boil.
I'm getting scared sitting next to you.
And did not even mention the word plagiarism, because incorporating someone else's poem into, and there is a publication, she published the poem A Kiss in Yiddish in 1918, and there is a footnote saying that this poem was published in Hebrew by Gnessin unbeknownst to me. So she knew early on what he did. She might have not read the novella until the 50s, but it's in the Yiddish press that she did know.
It's a little confusing to me. There is somewhere it was stated that he can do with it what he wants, and I don't know where that was. That she actually said that. I'm sorry, I don't remember.
No, it was, yes, maybe it was in the memoir that she wrote, the Hebrew that was published in Hebrew.
Well, it's confusing because I did read that. It's like that he kind of ripped it off, or at least she felt that way.
I don't remember when he died. He died in does anyone remember, 1913, maybe? He died
really young.
And I think she might have not known that he used it in the novella. So
right.
It's the power dynamic in
right.
literary world sort of continues. It's not only what you said about misogyny in American literary milieu. Yiddish literary milieu had the same issues, I would say.
I'd love to read these memoirs. I think it would be so interesting to lay the memoirs up against the poems, and I think
there is crossover there. I mean, you could see some of it's personal experience.
Yeah.
That it's in her poems and it's in the memoirs. In the memoirs, you'll see that there are crossovers. You can see the influence.
But I'm also wondering
poetry.
What's the difference? Like, where's the difference? I mean, no doubt that it would be like modeling based on the memoirs or the same experiences. But I'm just thinking of the way, for example, we came to understand Isaac Babel's stories, which when I first read them through Lionel Trilling's introduction, I thought, well, Isaac Babel's just writing down his own experience, that these poems seem exactly like what happened to him in Odessa growing up. Then you read Isaac Babel's journals, and you see that there is it's not that they're not related, but they are not the same. That the journals are different. They have a different style, and there's a different construction in the stories that makes them different as stories. And what I'm trying to get at here is what Emily Dickinson said in a letter to someone, one of her friends, and said, when I speak of myself in a poem, I do not mean me exactly, I mean myself as the representative of the verse. And I think that there's an element here, it's all based on personal experience, I do not doubt that. But I think that, I guess what I would say is she's having a lot of other personal experiences too. For example, you could probably read her poems and not know she has 6 children.
That's true.
You don't really know much about her marriage. You don't really know much about the milieu that she's in. And yet she's experienced all kinds of things. So this is not a criticism. It's a statement that experience is being filtered in a certain way, in what I would say a very artful and condensed, concentrated way, to give this tremendous impact of the poems. And so I don't want to underestimate, I guess what I'm trying to get is I don't want to underestimate them as poems, at the way that this personal experience gets filtered and dramatized so that we feel blown away by the way that the impact of these. And you could see it, the way you did it on the screen was just wonderful, because you could actually hear the voice, and then you could actually see the poems, and you just feel them like come burning through the screen, really. So that's just a wonderful quality of the film.
Oh, thank you.
I'm so grateful that you're saying that, because there was sort of Yiddish literary critics of the beginning of the 20th century had this tendency to merge a person, especially if the poet happened to be a woman, with their personal experiences in the poem, thus sort of eliminating the artistry, the aesthetic quality of the poetry. And I have a feeling that very often, especially I observe it among my students very often at Columbia, this tendency to look at every work of art through the life of the poet, because everything is just based on personal experience. It is, but as you were just saying, it's transformed through the artistic process. And there is a risk of like, oh, we've learned the entire story of Gnesin, but I don't want people to go to Dropkin's poems and like, oh, it's just the whole volume is about Gnesin one way or another. There is so much more to her artful exploration of the human experience in her poetry.
Beautiful. That's great. I think we should let people ask some questions.
All right, we have time for about 3 audience questions. I saw middle hand go up first.
What's next for the film?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I would like to see it get more attention. And in that vein, I'm trying to develop some strategies to get people to watch it more. So what I'm trying to do is I want to introduce some people reading Yiddish. One of the criticisms was that we didn't hear enough Yiddish. I think that came from a lot of Yiddishists. But that's fine. It's a fair criticism. You don't really hear the language, and you get a feeling of the language. And I think that's a fair criticism. So with that criticism, and then I started to think through how can we get more viewers? And I wanted to approach some well-known Jewish actors or celebrities to simply read Yiddish, read one of Celia's poems in Yiddish. And I did a couple of tests and some videos, and it's worked out quite well. But I want to get some well-known people, and it's very hard to get them. I'll give you just a few, and and it's not exclusive. So if anybody has any thoughts, please, I'm glad to hear them. Mayim Bialik. Mandy Patinkin, Fran Drescher apparently speaks Yiddish. So the thought is to try and get some celebrities and introduce them into the film. Reading every once in a while, you'll see this person come up. So at least there'll be more incentive for people if people see that there's those names in the film, because I like the film. I think it's done, it's a good film. Why can't it get more people? And it keeps, people say to me, it's a niche film. It's a niche film. Well, yes, it is a niche film, but why can't more people see it? I always felt like if this had come out during the Me Too movement, that it would have gotten so much more attention, given the fact that she was such a forerunner. I just think it would have gotten more attention. And then there's an aspect of Yiddish that people just don't know about. So it brings people,
Well, you did a very good job, like in 7 frames to explain
just to
what
explain
Yiddish
Yiddish.
is
Well, that's
and
for
what Yiddish literature
that's for the Gentile audience,
Yeah.
mostly. Anyway, anybody have connections to either of those actors or anybody you think? Please tell me and let me know.
I'm curious to know, even though it's like all over the film, what is the Jewishness? Where is the Jewishness in her writing? And I'm wondering if maybe it has something to do with unfulfilled emancipation.
Unfulfilled what?
Emancipation.
Emancipation. I think it's a fair question, and the answer is she really didn't self-identify as a Jew. She was much more of a humanist. They were secular. They didn't go. Best of my knowledge, they never went to synagogue. She was just a secular Jew. So the fact that there is no particularly Jewish themes, but I mean these guys can speak about that a little bit more. I think it's not a bad question.
I think if you're writing in Yiddish, I don't think that's something you have to worry about, except maybe to go against the grain of what people might expect from Yiddish literature. And I was glad to see that moment of Sholem Aleichem, because that's what people think.
Of course.
They're going to think it's what you're going to get. Or I guess what I would say is, this poetry is in an argument with Yiddish literature. And it's against the kind of shtetl mentality of that this is the subject matter of what Yiddish literature is supposed to be, and that seems to me. Well, I said to a friend of mine who's a rabbi, yeah, the trouble is I don't believe in God. And she said, yes, that's a very Jewish position. And then I said, so Kafka said I have hardly anything in common with other. How can I have anything in common with other Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself. She goes, yes, that's a common Jewish feeling. You can't win with these people. You can't get out of this tribe. And I think that's what I would say about her. You can't get out of this tribe because you're writing in Yiddish and you're rebelling against. I like your idea about a kind of wistful longing and freedom for, unattained freedom, I think would be thematically. But I don't think you need to look at it thematically except being against the grain of certain expectations for Yiddish literature. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, and I would just add, again, going back to sort of European modernist roots. So many Yiddish women poets in particular would not explore very explicit Jewish themes in their works, partially because they also got different education in contrast to modern Yiddish male writers, who most of them went through yeshiva and rebelled later on, so had a very rich background of cultural sort of wealth to draw on, whereas women went through secular education in Poland, Russia, so had a lot of artistic influences from that sphere. Would add that.
I'm just thinking of an analogy in Irish poetry where my friend Evan Boland sort of made the case that certain subjects, especially the heroic struggle of the nation for freedom, were the subjects of Irish poetry, and that was a male-dominated poetry. And as a result, the whole experience of women's lives, their whole domesticity, the whole realm of experience of half the population was off limits for Irish poetry. And that Irish poetry, great as it was prescribed. And I think if you just turn this a little, you can see Yiddish literature, great as it is, has certain subjects that are very prescribed. And someone like Dropkin comes along and wants to blow that up based on her own personal experience.
All right, we have time for one more question.
We know of Jung Vilna, the Association of Yiddish Poets and Writers in Vilna before the war in 1920s and 1930s. So I was wondering, did they know of each other? Or was there any connection between Yiddish poets writing in Europe, in Vilna, and New York, and apparently there were immigrants from Lithuania as well to New York.
That's a great question. Oh yeah, of course they knew about each other, and many of them, almost all American Yiddish poets were stemmed from Europe. And even when they came here, they maintained artistic and personal relationships with people back there. So definitely the influences were much larger than it's usually assumed. So we teach minority literatures like Yiddish or Irish or Polish in sort of isolation from surrounding literatures, and there was always an interaction, and they were influencing one another? That's a great question.
We can, if there's anybody else has any questions.
There's one person who's been...
I know there's more. Can we do a couple more? Oh, I don't care. It doesn't matter. But again, we can also meet at the back of the room for any questions. So, but let's do a couple more, and then we'll meet at the back of the room.
The context of all of this is you have two things going on. You have anti-Semitism, and you have the poverty rising as populations rise and economies don't, and that leads to wars and the Holocaust and everything else. But so the question is, how did the mother at the age of 22 with two little kids to feed, how was that possible for her to do that and also then even get an education for the girls in that context?
You're asking about the Eastern European sort of context for the story of the mother, right? I don't think we have time for the lecture on the Eastern European history, but usually women were the breadwinners in traditional Jewish societies. So even when the husband was not around, they would be able to make a living by doing all kinds of jobs in a shtetl community. So I don't think it was impossible. It was definitely a challenge, but it did happen. I'm sorry.
Education also. There was
yes, and the communal support as well.
Communal support and a reference to education.
Yes. Maybe last one.
Oh, Sheva.
Yeah.
Sheva has a question. Now, Sheva will be the last question, or a statement, Sheva. Anything you want to say?
Actually, I was going to ask a question, but first I would like to just address the question that gentleman asked. They were not poor at all. They went to live with relatives.
At the rich relatives.
They had rich relatives who supported them. They were the Golodietz family or something. So, yeah. I don't know if the mother had to work or not. Mazel tov, that was really wonderful. I had no idea when you came 6 years ago, 7, whenever it was.
We don't mention it.
No. Takes a long time. What you had in mind, this was really lovely. I'm just wondering more about that memoir. Does it end in Eastern Europe, or is it all about, there was something about Hillel Zeitlin. You sent me some of it, I think.
About what?
Hillel Zeitlin, the Yiddish philosopher, and he tried to seduce her, but that's another story.
No, I don't remember that. Sorry.
You don't remember?
No.
But does the memoir end in Eastern Europe, or does she describe America? Where does it?
Yes, I think it does end in. I think it ends. It's strictly about her memories of Genessen, so it does end. It does end in Eastern Europe. Yes, but
so before we end, I want to extend my gratitude and thanks to you guys and for the film to come to be. I want to mention two things. One of the very powerful moments in my recent time was I actually got a copy of Dropkin's 1935 in Heißen Wind, thanks to amazing David Mazauer, who located it in Yiddish Book Center. And I have to tell you, this felt like discovering the a Tutankhamun's grave that this copy exists. And second, I want to give a shout out again to Anita Norwich, who is here, who translated Celia Dropkin's novel that was mentioned,
right.
Two Feelings, that
Anita,
is in English as Desires, that came out in July. So if you're looking for more engagement with Dropkin, look it up.
Thank you, everybody.